So initially our presentation titled Small Cities Vulnerability Assessment and Planning Adaptation to Climate Change. But we considered results and sources which we have, and we a little bit changes. We focused on cities. And before starting sharing some general experience in this area, I would like to say that climate change is now very popular theme for public discussions, for scientific research, for educational activities, and so on, so on, so on. At the level of different cities in Ukraine, since 2015, we started administrative territorial reform, and so many new united, amalgamated communities organized on the territory of Ukraine, and each of these new structure is working to develop their own strategy of development, and so on, so on, so on. And of course, climate change is one of the most important issues, because by 2050, more than 6 billion people will live in cities. It will consist of 70% of world's populations. And residents of megacities accounts for 2/3 of energy consumptions and up to 80% of global greenhouse gas emissions. And cities are most vulnerable to climate change. 70% of megacities are already facing the climate change effect, and especially coastal ones are in danger. First of all, due to threats of flooding from rising sea level, abnormal weather events, etc. And cities are not only subject to physical destruction, but also subject to economic damage in the aftermath of natural disasters. Climate change is a reality, and climate change refers to any change in climate over time, whether due to natural variability, which we call natural climate change, or as a result of human activity, anthropogenic climate change. And climate change causes impacts of natural and human system. And what is important, climate change impacts are manifested locally. So climate change is a reality, and we can mitigate, adapt to, or just neglect and suffer from such changes. But we can influence an anthropogenic component of climate change. However, we are powerless to influence natural processes. And in this case, two types of responses are required in order to address climate change issues: mitigation and adaptation. Mitigation is an anthropogenic intervention to reduce anthropogenic forcing of the climate system. And mitigation mainly includes strategies to reduce greenhouse gas sources and emissions and enhance greenhouse gas absorptions. On the other hand, adaptation to climate change is the adjustment to adjustment of natural and human systems in response to actual or expected climatic stimuli or their effects, which moderates harm or exploits beneficial opportunities. Reasons why do we need to adapt to climate change are following. Climate is already changing. It's a reality. Climate change impacts are already occurring even more quickly than it was predicted before. Near-term significant reduction of greenhouse gas emissions is unlikely, and climate change impacts will occur long after the climate greenhouse gases are stabilized. Without actions, the impacts of climate change will increase rapidly, and some changes will be irreversible. Delaying actions will only exacerbate the economic, environmental, and social costs. And early action will allow to take full advantage of the opportunities arising from the climate change. Especially adaptation is important for human settlements, and priority objective for both public and private sectors is minimizing impacts in cities, since cities are centers of economic activity and concentrate both population and assets. Assessment of climate risk and vulnerabilities is one of the first steps in the adaptation cycle, which provides the necessary information. Briefly speaking, what, where, why, and this information will support tailored proactive measures to each site-specific context, how to react. Scheme on climate change adaptation cycle is presented on this slide, and it looks like very similar to many other cycles which we use in planning and developing strategic activities, strategic actions at different level. And first stage is preparing the ground. I will discuss this issue in more details because it creates the ground for assessing risk and vulnerabilities. And having in mind assessed risks and vulnerabilities of systems subjected to climate effects, we may identify adaptation options. We may select best of these adaptation options and design action plan. Implementation of each will lead to some desirable results. And this process will be definitely monitored and evaluated. And based on the results of monitoring and evaluation, we will change our activities, we will change our action plan. So the first step of the cycle is very analytical. An analysis of meteorological indicators and their dynamics for the last 3-5 decades is the first step. And we have to identify trends and scenarios of further climate changes. This analysis will help us to determine the climate factors of influence, hazards, I mean. And hazards, it's physically defined climate events with a potential to cause harm, such as heavy rainfall, drought, flood, storm, and long-term changes in mean climatic variables such as temperature and precipitation. To consider how to do it in practice, we selected 2 Ukrainian cities. One of these is Zaporizhia, and second one is Odessa. I just put some information about Zaporizhia city. The city of Zaporizhia is located in steppe zone on the bank of Dnipro River, on both sides of Dnipro River. It's quite large city by Ukrainian meaning because it comprises over 700,000 of population, and city is one of the most powerful industrial center of Ukraine. Currently, over 290 industrial enterprises are functioning, operating in the city. If we look at data from meteorological station Zaporozhye, probably you have noticed that I used 2 forms of writing, Zaporizhia and Zaporozhye. Zaporozhye is international name of meteorological station. So analysis of data regarding average annual surface air temperature presented on these charts, and you may see that temperature, at least since since the end of 19th century, is slowly growing. But last 30, 40 years, the increase is going more rapidly. And the temperature has seasonal distribution, and most warm period is summer period in this region. As regards to as regards to Odessa, we have very similar picture. We have very similar picture as well. Temperature is increasing during last, I don't know, 100 years or even more, and this increase is accelerating during the last decades. As regards to precipitation, in general terms, in the period since the end of 19th century, we may see that precipitation is almost the same, but at the end of 20th century and beginning of 21st century, precipitation is increasing, and this increase is approximately 15 millimeters per 10 years since 1990. Very similar picture, but numbers are a little bit different. We observe in Odessa city. I would like to emphasize that Odessa is located on the shore of the Black Sea, and Zaporizhia is located on the Dnipro River, and approximately, I don't know, 200 kilometers from the Azov Sea, in steppe zone. So cities very similar by population and industrial potential, but located in a little bit different condition. Another issue related as well to precipitation. Then if you consider dynamic of annual number of days with rain and snow, we see that these indicators are going in different, tendencies of these indicators are going in different way. Number of days with rain in the region is increasing, and number of days with snow is decreasing, which confirms that climate is warming. And the same tendencies we observe in Odessa. As regards to the extreme weather events like thunderstorms, we see in very interesting picture. Since 1960, we see a strong increase in number of days with thunderstorms. So number of days with rain is increasing slowly, but more quickly increasing in the number of days with thunderstorms. It means that number of extreme weather events is becoming more often, more high, and these events are observing more often. The same we see in Odessa, city. And summarizing these results, we may consider that air surface temperature is increasing, at least during last, not at least, but especially during last 4-5 decades. Duration of the cold period is decreasing. The amount of precipitation on one hand is redistributed by seasons, and during the last decades is increasing, and number of natural meteorological phenomena and extreme weather events is decreasing. It gives us food for analysis and to make conclusions about main temperature hazards for the environment, infrastructure, and population in both cities. So we may see that extreme hot, heat waves, extreme cold, wildfires, droughts, and shortage of water resources are typical and most important temperature hazards. And especially during the last 2 years, we were witnesses of very extreme situation. 2020 was extremely hot year and accompanied with lots of wildfires during spring period and early autumn period. As regards to precipitation hazards, the key of them are heavy precipitations, including rainfall and snowfall, or lack of precipitation. We had 2020 year with lack of precipitation. It may cause spread of infection diseases and intensify of erosions and damage and agricultural crops and assets of infrastructure. As regards to hazards related to extreme weather event, we may include flooding, expansion of wetlands, storms, damage to green areas, including agricultural land and forest, violation of the integrity and functioning of the energy supply system, water supply system, transport networks, and some other violation of integrity and functioning of the infrastructure facilities, residential and non-residential buildings, and activation of erosion processes, in particular and very strongly on shores of water bodies. The impact of these threats will have different consequences depending on the vulnerability of the systems and exposure. Exposure is a nature and degree to which a system is exposed to significant climatic variations. And systems which are vulnerable and presents different sectors of human activities and natural environment includes houses and buildings, transport system, energy, water system, waste management system, land use and planning, agriculture and forestry, environment, ecosystem and biodiversity, health issues, civil protection and emergencies, tourism, and some other sectors. But most important, these are which could be adversely affected. And as regards to vulnerability, it's a propensity or predisposition to be adversely affected. Vulnerability is a degree to which a system is susceptible to and unable to cope with adverse effects of climate change. Vulnerability is a function of the character, magnitude, and rate of climate change and variation to which a system is exposed, its sensitivity and its adaptive capacity. And used to be a vulnerability level assessed as low, moderate, high, and probably not known. Different system of population, natural environment, infrastructure will have different vulnerability, different components will have different vulnerability. If we consider population, so we may see that population consists of many vulnerable groups like women and girls, children, youth, elderly people, marginalized groups, disabled people, persons with chronic diseases, low-income households, unemployed persons, and persons living in substandard conditions, migrants and displaced people, and probably some others. So, assessing vulnerability of each group, we may come to different conclusions. And this is important for assessment of to define most significant hazards that may affect the city. I mean, infrastructure, population, natural environment. So this is just an example of determination of hazards which are effective for city of Zaporizhia. Hazards which cause risk and may be assessed by different indicators. For example, extreme heat we consider as a high risk because it's really natural. And this risk is increasing because situation in climate tendencies confirms this. Expected change in hazard frequency as well, increasing. Time frame, it's important to consider for medium and long term for planning activities. And indicators for this, we may consider number of days with extremely high temperature and frequency of heat and cold waves, and the same number of days with cold period. We may consider different climate hazards. This slide represent only those which, just to give example and to understand what is important in defining following steps. Risks associated with climate change assessed as it presented on this chart. Climate hazards like extreme hot would be considered which generate high risk, and this risk will be increasing in medium and long term period. And other risks we may consider by such template. As regards to expected impacts of climate change effects on sectors and facilities in the city of Zaporizhia, I just put as an example with water supply and water sewage system. Hazards like extreme hot, probability of such hazards is very high, expected impact of hazards moderate, and it will lead to increase of water consumptions. On one hand, water consumption, because it's understandable. Extreme rainfall, probability is very high, expected impact of this hazard is very high, and the impact indicators will relate to number and percentage of water supply facilities affected by extreme rainfall, and increased costs of elimination of violation of such effect. This is an example, but using such algorithms, we may make assessment all other hazards. And keeping in mind determinant hazards, risks, and possible impacts, we may consider what kind of adaptation actions we may design, determine which to be implemented will mitigate or prevent these risks and hazards. As well, just simple example, in the field, in the sector of transport, if we will plan and implement measures focused on construction and reconstruction of roads, and will take into account resistance to climate factors, in particular to high temperature, showers, storms. So such actions will prevent more huge damage. Another issue, planning and implementation of constructions and operation of roads taking into account areas of flooding, as well will help to avoid huge damages during extreme weather events. As regards to human health, first of all, we have to inform people about expected uncertainties or extreme events which are coming. Improving the emergency notification system or emergency warning system. In the case of, in particular, expecting hot weather, heavy precipitation, storms, dust storms, etc., will help to avoid serious impact on human health. Monitoring of vulnerable groups, like identification of their number, distribution, etc., to coordinate actions aimed at helping in case of hot weather or extreme events, as well, very important. Maintaining the readiness of healthcare system to respond to emergencies is extremely important. So putting on the list and making plan with such activities and determining time frame for implementation will help to adapt to and avoid serious effects of climate change. On the other hand, climate change provides some opportunities for human activities. For example, keeping in mind that number of vegetation seasons due to the increasing number of warm days, we have other opportunities for development of agricultural activities. For example, for cultivations of more heat-loving plants. And probably in southern part of Ukraine already is it possible to have two crops during one vegetation period. Reduction of heating season help us to save some resources for heating our buildings and facilities. Increasing number of sunny days help us to develop solar energy and so on. So such opportunities can be as well included in adaptation plan. Actually, on this at this point, I would like to stop and just inform about action plan for adaptation to effects of climate change in the city of Zaporizhzhia, which was developed in 2020. Action plan, no strategy, but action plan. And you may look at this plan and be informed about what's going on in Zaporizhzhia. But the most important for me is a conclusion that during planning and assessment period, it's the most enthusiastic period. But after approving of action plan, actually, it's a point to start the most important activities. But for most involved public activists and specialists, it's already is becoming a period of routine work and not so interesting. So summarizing approach to planning climate change adaptation, I just would like to point out that the first steps, like description of the region, city, town, human settlements in terms of infrastructure, population, natural condition, is a ground points with accompanied with collection and analysis of the climate data. Assessment of the climate hazards and impacts is the next step, which helps to determine the vulnerable objects and systems, make assessment of the vulnerabilities and risks, and elaborate adaptation measures and alternatives to manage these risks. And choosing the optimal alternatives will be put in action plans. And some useful sources for activities in this area I provide, and thank you for your attention.